the distilled budget fine print. So, what were the takeaways from the union budget in general and specific? What's the immediate and long term, and how many people will benefit from the new income tax exemptions? And there are some interesting numbers coming up. And what made the government reduce taxes for a segment, which is the middle class, which is actually quite small? I caught up with Ashok K Bhattacharya, editorial director and columnist at Business Standard, and Jairaj Purandare of JMP Advisors, who also sits on the board of several companies and was earlier chairman of Ernst Young India.
Couple of points that I would like to make is that this budget seems to signal shifting of gears the way the government is looking at the economy. In a sense that in the post-COVID world, the government was looking at investment as the main stimulus for reviving growth. And I think there has been a change of approach. It may be also seen as the political imperative of bringing about this change at this juncture. But I think it is a shifting of gears that is really becoming very, very clear. Not so much as in capital expenditure has not been completely be done away with. The growth of capital expenditure continues to be in double digits, which 10%. But clearly the government is convinced that it is not enough to revive growth, because I think it is little disappointed with India Inc. in not responding to the kind of incentives it thought it gave, particularly a cut in the corporation tax rate. So it wants to give this kind of income tax relief to the middle class. Remember, this middle class is a very small, tiny proportion of India's population. But that is what I think is one. Number two, I would say, is that government is through this budget is trying to prepare this policy apparatus to take on the global uncertainties to some ways, in a sense that the custom duty rationalization seems to be aimed at that. It may not be enough, but I think there are early signals that it recognizes the need for some sort of customs tariff rejig, which it needs to undertake to take on the post-Trumpian world. And number three, and the final point I would make, fiscal consolidation program, in a sense that changing course, moving more towards a kind of a debt anchoring, but probably it requires greater fine-tuning in the sense that it only talks about a 50% debt level that will bring down the fiscal deficit towards its desired course, but it does not take into account the fact that today the sum total of the states in this country is actually more than the central budget. So therefore, to inspire confidence of the markets in fiscal prudence, it needs to follow a path that takes into account that what the states are doing at their level. I would limit my preliminary observations to these three broad trends that I see, Ajit.
Thank you, Govind, for inviting me to be here. Of course, broadly agree with what Ashok just mentioned. At the same time, I'd like to add a few important points, I think. One is that this budget actually presents fairly prudent approach to the fiscal. And if you just look at what she said 4 years ago, the fiscal deficit at that time was 9.2%, and they had committed that by next year they will get it down under 4.5%. And they have lived up to that and pretty much made a commitment to go to 4.4% of fisc next year, which is, I think, good. The glide path has been fairly smooth and they've lived up to their promise. I think that's important. But I think one other key thing is that they're also focusing on the debt to GDP. As was mentioned earlier, they are at about 57% at the central government level. And when you add the states, it's about 85%. But clearly, again, they're moving in the right direction. And it's expected that in the next year or two, this will get down to something like 50%, 49%. So that's a very good sign, I think. So the second point I was making is that the government seems to be thinking, instead of just year by year, a more medium-term plan exercise, which I think only can inspire confidence. And this I take away from a few examples in the budget announcements. But one of them was in the tax changes that they're proposing. And they're talking of changing the sunset clause, not by a year, but by 5 years, in several provisions relating to IFSC units, relating to startups, and so on. So I think that's a good sign that they are actually moving towards that sort of thinking. The third important thing is they announced that they want to revamp the tax code. And I'm very glad that they are in the point of doing that. It's going to come out next week. And more importantly, I think, and I'm hoping they carry this through fully, is that this will probably get implemented next year. And before that, will get referred to the Standing Committee on Finance. They will get consultation, feedback from the public at large, from professionals, experts, etc., so that we will have something which is much more robust. These are all signs of, more broader, longer term thinking and radical changes. The other thing which I would like to just point out is that, anything which is being thought through is, I know they sound like policy announcement, but we are in the context of India looking at large policy changes, large spends. So all the numbers are huge. So, while she was cruising along in her budget speech, the finance minister, it's almost like the, last over six, preserved the best for the last and sort of announced the big jump in one sweep, of the income tax exemption going up to 12 lakhs, which was, I think, a very bold, very good move. Because I think, as initially sort of mentioned, it's going to drive spend, it's going to drive consumption, going to drive demand. But importantly, I think if it drives demand, will then drive private sector capex and investment to happen, which is what has been missing in the last few years, despite whatever requests and appeals have been made to the private sector.
Just a quick one on the direct tax code, Jairaj. Wasn't there an expectation that it will be actually delivered now rather than going into a standing committee and that whole process here on for another what looks like a year?
The last budget, which was in July 24, she mentioned that in 6 months, she expects to have this delivered. So there was initially the expectation that it's going to become law starting April 1, 25. But somewhere down the line, we heard news from North Block in our discussions with the government that this is going slow. Then they started accelerating the process because they felt that they really need to live up to what they said. So at one level, I would have liked to see it introduced now, but I'm happy that they are introducing it as a draft paper, as a draft code, will consult widely, will refer it to the standing committee. 60 odd years we've been looking at the old income tax law, which has become so complicated. It's got 1400 plus provisos, by the way. And she's promised that it's going to be far more simpler, more rational. And I do hope they rationalize it and bring it to more current levels, sort of things. But can you imagine reading a law which has proviso after proviso in every odd section?
AKP, so let me pick up on 2-3 points from your comments. So first is, of course, you talked about the middle class being a very small segment and yet obviously getting a fairly significant or significant looking tax break. So the question is why then?
Because probably the government, in its wisdom, believes that it must shift gears. It's also a refutable fact that it is politically more expedient in today's environment. So there is economic logic. It's a fact that more money in the hands of segment. I did a quick calculation around 43 million people who will be benefited in general and overall. So the question is, will those 43 million people will keep that money in their banks or put that money in their mutual fund savings? Or will they go out in the market and buy goods and services? So that's a gamble, I would say, the government is taken. This is a gamble. More safe and a secure strategy would have been use that 1 lakh crore to invest in avenues and areas and sectors wherein the multiplier effect as far as growth is concerned may not be immediate, may not be immediately 1 year, but maybe in 2 years down the line. I think the government has also recognized the fact that the absorptive capacity of its investment have actually seen deterioration in a sense that you put the blame on elections, but the elections were over in June. But in spite of that, the first half of the current financial year, well into December, the government could not spend its money. So even in the next year's budget, you have got 1.5 lakh crore given as part of the capex loan to the states. So the question is, the larger government system needs to be more efficient to absorb this kind of additional investment. So probably the government realized the limitations of the government system, and instead of going in for major revamp of the government system to speed up its such investments and yield those results, may have gone in for an easier option of benefiting those 43 million people with higher disposable income and see that it will result in more demand. And but I think it's a gamble. Once again, I would say that it may pay off, it may not pay off.
Okay. So if you were to put that aside, what's the larger sense you got? I mean, if you look at previous budgets, and I'm also obviously asking this in the context of the US now imposing tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China, and it's obviously a different world. I mean, do you get a sense that this budget is geared for what is happening around us, including maybe equipping businesses to play on a stronger footing, including making life easy for them?
I don't see any attempt in the budget to outline how it wants to deal as far as this global trade is concerned. There is no indication whether the government will like to extend its trading arrangements with different blocks. There is CPTPP going back to RCEP. Maybe RCEP is a strict no-no because of China, but CPTPP is no China. So, there are no indications that prove its exports, which are critical for improving your growth and manufacturing sector. I don't see any such overtures in the budget that we will be more open to joining these trading arrangements. The only thing that I've seen in this budget is the customs duties have been rationalized. And once again, it is responding to US president who is threatening with higher tariffs.
Anything else, AKB, that struck you as something that was, let's say, more long-term-ish, either
I think
directionally or
I
thematically?
think the long-term issue is that is announcements on regulatory framework reviews. I mean, for example, it wants to put in place a mechanism under the Financial Sector Development Council, mechanism by which it can regulate and monitor the manner in which the regulatory functions happen. Similarly, on the non-financial sector, it wants to set up a committee to look into those regulatory architecture. So this is probably taking off from where the economic survey talked about the deregulation stimulus. So the government is following up on that, which is a welcome sign, and it is a long term in nature. So that is what I would say, which is a very welcome sign, actually.
Right. Jairaj, you mentioned that one of the things the government has done is to give more lease of life to laws. You talked about the 5-year extension. But are you confident that even if we may say 3 years or 3 years to 5 years, that these things stand as they are without, let's say, additional guidelines or subsections being imposed later from experience?
So this is just the sunset clauses that have been extended by 5 years that I mentioned. Politicians have to take a bigger and broader view and not necessarily get completely influenced by what the bureaucrat may want to do, and with some bureaucrats wanting to look at the micros and bring in all these minute permutations and combinations and make the law more complex. In today's world, I didn't see any huge announcements as to how we're going to even attempt to deal with it. There was no mention of it, which was a bit surprising to me. But there's clearly things on the agenda which need urgent attention. I think what the economic survey says is quite right. Get out of the way. Let business do business. Just get out of the way. We've also got into a situation where we've just moved from government approvals to regulatory approvals. We're still, if not in the license Raj, but in the regulated approval Raj. That doesn't help. So this light regulation is a must, and I really hope they take it very seriously and act on it within the 1 year that they've promised. So that's very important. On the fiscal side, there's a lot to be done in terms of simplification, especially on the GST side of things. Income tax looks as if it's going in the right direction. But again, the GST Council and the GST notifications and complex laws are not helping. And they just need to help business to carry on with their business. I like the focus on manufacturing, especially in the MSME sector where you're likely to provide more jobs. So clearly the focus is perhaps in the right direction. But I think much more is required in the manufacturing area. And I still believe that we have not really captured the opportunity of China plus one, as they say. So we seem to have missed the bus almost a little bit. And I was hoping that they will get back onto the bus in this budget. They made some noises, they made some changes, especially on the MSME side. But for example, they seem to be adamant on this lower rate of corporate tax, which sunset clause happened last year. I would have liked to see that extended. Invite manufacturing, let people come and set up doing business. You are getting foreign investment, you're getting the dollars, and it's permanent capital, once you get FDI into the country. I would like to see more of that. On the fiscal side, we were expecting a couple of other things like the global minimum tax of 15%. But I think with the US and Trump making adverse noises on the tariff side, I think I didn't see any real strategy articulated so far. And maybe the government is doing its thinking still in terms of how to react should the US raise tariffs. How will that impact us? Will China dump goods into India? How are we going to treat that? How will it impact our exports? And how are we going to counter that? Because if there are tariffs in the US, so some of these things I've heard that work is going on in North Block, etc. But we haven't seen the light of day on that, and I'd like to see that as quickly as possible. And even on the fiscal side, as I mentioned, even the capital gains tax, they said they've done simplified it, but it remains pretty complex even as of now. So I hope as part of the new code, they also simplify what they're doing currently on the capital gains tax. So lots more things, but these are just few of the major flags.
AKB and Jairaj, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Govind.